My name is Michael Harriot, if you didn't know. I think there's probably a graphic that shows you that. And I am the author of Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America. And today we have with us Professor, my sensei, Blair Kelley, who is an author, a historian. Right now, she is the Joel R. Williamson Professor of Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is distinguished, though. So I want to welcome her to, I don't know what this is, a podcast, a chat, but welcome her. And so for some background, Professor Kelley actually kind of created a curriculum, what I call the curriculum for me, to kind of, I not go all over the place with his book and, divide up the history into segments and explore certain topics. And, she'd always say, well, if we're going to talk about this, then we have to talk about this. And of course, you can't write all of the history of all of the Black people in America. But I think a book like this, she taught me that there are some things you have to discuss, and that gives the reader a sense of what our history encompasses. And she also has a book that I don't know how she did this. She wrote a book while she was helping me write a book. Like, that's how distinguished she is. Her book is Black Folk. Tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, Black Folk is exploring the history of the Black working class, using my ancestors and other people's ancestors and oral histories to get at what it means to be Black working class. I think both you and I are interested in the experience of Blackness. And that's why it was so much fun to help you with your project, because I think we have that same kind of viewpoint, grounded in where we're from and then what our ancestors have been through. And so that's what Black Folk really does. It talks about the Black working class, not just as organizers or atomized workers, but really as people who lived in communities and had whole real lives and experiences, and tries to get back to their viewpoint and the ethic that they pushed in promoting what it meant to be a citizen, what it meant to be a member of their community, and how they cared for one another.
And, all of that is interesting. You one of the things that you said, right, is, you're using oral history. And so often, like, historians categorize history and explain history by stuff that was written down and dismiss the oral histories. And one of the things that we talk about in my book, and like the idea that history and how it's perceived by some, how that history can't be objective by just from the person who writes the history is making choices on what to include and what to exclude. And those choices are subjective. And how do you feel like that subjectivity has impacted the way that we understand history?
I think, it's interesting because in grad school, as you said, they preached objectivity. They preached, looking through the sources with this neutral eye. But the neutral eye really meant like not us. And for me, the things that my mother, my grandmother, my grandfather, my great-grandfather knew about the world are information and ways of knowing and knowledges and histories that are just as valid as what someone was writing down in the census, maybe a bit more valid than that, right? Because the census taker is just looking and judging and making quick decisions, where the stories that get passed down to me are really drawing on people's experiences and can get to things that we can't know from these other kinds of historical records. So for me, I'm layering, and you're doing the same thing. We're layering the different ways of knowing, the archival ways with the ways that our ancestors gave us. And so For me, the combination of both the personal and the archival is really powerful.
And so I can dig into each one of your answers, but what you said about the census, there are, that's something that historians lean on heavily as, data, as fact. But, in writing my book and researching the census records of my family, I realized like the census isn't an objective source, really.
No,
It is a subjective
census
source.
was some guy roaming by your ancestors' house and looking at people and deciding, well, this light skinned person might be mulatto. Let me put a big old M here this year. And maybe that next year, 10 years later, when that next census taker comes by, they might be like, that person's black, and just put a B. And so, nothing changed about the person they were looking at. Maybe they got a little more sun that week or something. But, it's just that gaze from the outsider. They were misspelling names, they were mishearing things. They're just government workers who are passing by. So they're interesting documents in that they can capture a snapshot of what a person saw, but you have to take all that with a grain of salt, just as you have to with any historical record. I love all those archival records. I love all those oral histories because they're all clues, and they're pieces of the puzzle that we're trying to put back together. But we do, like you said, we have to put ourselves into that conversation in order to figure out, like, what does this mean?
Right. Like there's, looking at the census records of my family, like I have generations of Irvins, and so many of the census records spell it so many different ways with an I, with the E. Like at some point he became Irby. And so like it's just like some white people like, just write down Irby. And the interesting thing about your book to me, and my book too, is how we used family, not just oral histories, but our stories and our families to explain and to focus the history through that lens. And in a sense, right, that's how we understand the world, through our families, through our past. And that's how our past is history, and it's what informs us of the present. And so when you and I were kind of working on my book, there were stories that I was like, I got to include this story. There were stories that we left out of those histories. And one of the things I remember talking to you about is the idea of, I thought, well, I want this to be, I don't know if people are going to delegitimize it because I use that family lens. And you were the one that kind of gave me the confidence and say, no, that's a legitimate historical technique. Well, of course, now that has become critical race theory, since
Screw
and,
them.
and it's like, but one of the things that you told me about was like, oh, that's how they write their history too, right? Like the history that we generally consider is focused through the lens of whiteness and white stories and white oral histories. And one of the most explicit examples is something I never knew about until you told me about it. And it's like right in one of the first chapters of the book is about the cannibalism of the Jamestown people. Like I'd never heard of that until you said, oh yeah, well,
Yeah.
read the Smithsonian and here are the
Yeah.
sources. And
Yes.
but
I remember
but
learning that in one of my classes in undergrad, and he was like, so, the colonial times seems nice, right? And then he just throws the cannibalism at the whole class, and we're like, okay, so this is going to be a different kind of American history.
right. But it also undercuts that idea that like there were some really smart people and some really capable people who, through grit and hard work and self-determination, came here to form a new kind of country. And the actual history says, oh, they didn't really kind of know what they were doing, right? And
They were
that is a
struggling and
theme.
they were confused and they had a nasty turn.
That's a theme. throughout that
Oh
book,
my
right?
God.
So, and even in your book, right, the idea, because what's interesting to me about your book is, first of all, just the idea of a Black working class. We think of, you know, people who were enslaved, and then we go to people who are just making it any way they can. And we
Yeah.
don't think of that as a class of people, a working class of people who was building generational traits and generational, uh, morals for their future generations and for their descendants. And so, what do you think it is about that Black working class that created those successful generations and that lasted throughout those successive generations?
I think, both you and I grow up in families that taught us that there was an incredible dignity, there was vision, there was possibility, there was faith, there was a unique way of looking at the world, a knowledge that they had that was uniquely theirs. And it doesn't come from privilege or power, but it has its own kind of power. It's a, folks with the make a way out of no way. They knew how to build with one another, how to survive with one another. The reason that they survived slavery was because of it, and they take that out of slavery with them, and they have their own way of looking at the world that's so powerful and enables them to build up over time, to organize, to build unions, to strategize, to migrate, to stay at home, to do all kinds of things that we're now talking about, that laborers are thinking about. Laborers are thinking about that balance of life. And Black women were thinking about that balance of life in the 1860s, as soon as they were free, because they wanted to raise their own children. They valued their families, and they knew what it meant to be stripped away from their own households. And so they were like, nah, we're going to work, but we're going to do it this particular kind of way. So it's amazing to me that we're still having the same kinds of conversations about mobility and independence and working from home that Black women were struggling with in those first generations. They didn't have wealth, they didn't have a lot of funds, they didn't have a Zoom account, but boy, they had a vision of what could be possible if they worked together and they thought differently.
And what you talk about, though, what interested me is not just those stories and that pride and that work ethic, but how that laid the foundation, not just for Black people, but for like the labor system in America, and how we think of labor and how we think of like a 40-hour work week, how we think of Social Security, right? Like the domestics, how black domestics were excluded. And so how that kind of formed the economy of America. And so these aren't just personal stories of pride and
Yeah.
resilience. They inform us to the political and social and economic foundations that we sometimes take for granted. And so much of that, it's, when you really look into history, so much of that comes from Black people, Black
Mm-hmm.
people's ideas of what a fair and ethical government and economy would be like. And so much of that comes from Black women. When we think about a Black working class, so often we think about Black men and factory workers. But your book, enlightens us on Black women who were involved, who kind of conceived of the labor movement, and like who gave us like the stuff that we have today, like vacation days and PTO and all of that, right? Like I got to take care of these children and I got to work. And
Yeah.
those, how they conceived of doing that, we benefit from. And
Yes.
and so much of those little tiny things are what we miss when we talk about history, and like connecting the personal to the whole thing, or to the broad
Yeah.
view. What do you think those perspectives, like looking at things from an a family based or from those perspectives versus like data and numbers. What do you think that how does that push the understanding of history forward? And how's that
I
evolve
think
history?
we want to know about people. At the end of the day, statistics tell a kind of story, but nothing gets in our spirit and in our soul like a personal story. We can imagine ourselves, moving through those historical times. We can imagine being a teenager and deciding, I'm going to migrate, and just, running away from home and away from your parents and getting on a train. And, we can follow with those folks who are doing these amazing individual acts. They happen to be doing them on the tides of history, but they don't know that at the time. They think, I've heard a lot of people saying this, and they don't know they're, one of millions of people doing the same thing. They're just doing it for themselves. And so if we can imagine history from that on the shoulder viewpoint, if we can make it personal, if we can make it human, if we can make it real, we remind ourselves about our own capacity, about our own imaginations, about our own vision for change that can happen when we're inspired by those stories. And so we love a good story. We read fiction all the time because we're seeking those personal human stories. And so I love the opportunity to write history that includes those personal stories, the way that you draw on your family stories and these intimate, interesting, funny portraits of your family. It gives us something that we can't get from a stat, and it sticks with you. These are the things you remember for the rest of your life once you've read them.
So, your work now, and your book, and my book also kind of centers Black people in the South, and that Southern influence on Black culture and the American story, right? Like, what do you think it is about the South that like we are now like kind of rediscovering and recentering our stories in that uh we kind of left behind? Why do you think it is like the South is disregarded as an important part of American history? Because if you read, eighth grade social studies book, everything is about Boston and Philadelphia and New York and when they came there. And so the South is kind of seen as like the place that they drug along. And why do you think that story is kind of being retold now?
I think people didn't know what to think of Black people who didn't have much in a material way, right? I don't think they think about Black history much at all. I think the when you and I are framing and centering Black people at the root of the story, it enables you to see different dynamics and to think differently about how this history moves forward. And so when you think with Black people, you think about the Southern experience. The majority of us who are the descendant of the enslaved were held in bondage in the South. We may be moving to other parts of the country in the 20th century, but we're moving as Southerners. We're bringing that culture with us. I grew up in New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia, but the kinds of things that you were talking about in South Carolina were the things that my grandmother was doing in South Jersey and on her land. She was growing the same food. She was cooking the same way. She was teaching me those recipes and passing those things down as best she could because she was a Southern woman. She called herself Geechee. And she was excited to see those things in me and to be passed down to me. She didn't want me not to know those things and just know the things that were prevalent in Philadelphia's culture. So the power of what they did have, of the knowledges they did share, came from that Southern land. And they my ancestors wanted to have stayed. They ran because they were in fear of their lives. They knew that they couldn't survive there, but they knew that land, and they knew how to make it prosperous for others, and they knew that they could make it prosperous for themselves if they had only been given the opportunity. So it wasn't that they had beef with being Southern. It really was they wanted to survive. to live, to protect their sons and daughters, and to feed their families and to care for them and to prosper. And so they had to build that vision of prosperity outside of the South, but that didn't make them not Southern.
So when you talk about your families, move from Georgia and, how that informed them, I talk about, my family starting out in Lee County, South Carolina, and then Charleston, South Carolina, and kind of how that came to be. But, when we talk about history, like, what we term Black history, that is really American history, right? What do you think? Why do you think so? So, as a professor, you're a professor, right? Like, I'm just a guy who like knows a little
Makes
bit of
everybody
history and
laugh
then
and teaches us.
looks to say, like, Blair, teach me some history, right? But as a professor, right,
You teach me too. You teach me too all the
the
time.
the general consensus, and you've heard this before, like, our history is hidden. And one of the things you learn as when you really research history is, like, it's not that, like, our history was lost or like nobody knows where this stuff is. Like, when you talk about, I was like, I wish I could find out where these enslaved people, instead of referring to them as Africans, right? Because we refer to the Black people as Africans or African Americans, and then the white people are English and Dutch and Portuguese. We know their cultural backgrounds, we know their political motivations, we know their religious motivations, and then all the Black people are just Africans. And we assume, well, they stole us, and then from just someplace in Africa, and all that history was lost. And what we realize is, oh, that history, like, they knew where to go to get us, right? Like, when they wanted some rice farmers, it wasn't like they just found some Black people and taught them how to do rice. We taught them how to grow rice. And that history is known, right? They told each other, hey man, if you want some rice, you got to go over here and it became known as the Rice Coast or the Gold Coast. And so the narrative that, like, our history is lost or hidden, you got to dig a little bit. But why do you think that it has been? One can only assume that the reason we think that is because it intentionally hasn't been included in the narrative or the mythology that became American history, right? And we both talk about that, and these, what we call these lost things that are never really lost. Why do you think there is such a current pushback to not just correct the narrative, right, but just to add more detail to the narrative, like include more as we get more information? Why do you think there is a pushback against including more information into the knowledge base that is academia or history in general?
I think there's always going to be that backlash when we show up, and when we show up with detail and we show up with facts. There's always going to be a backlash. That there is no interest on some people's part to know anything about any of this and to pass any of it down. But it's powerful when we do. It provides not only the background that our children need to think about the world and their ancestors' place in it, but also that all Americans need to know about our past and how we got here and how America became what it is, how it actually became wealthy and powerful in the world, was in part because of the exploitation and the theft of our knowledge and our labor. In particular, there was no blank slate when it came to these Africans. They had a farming and agricultural skill. They had building skills. They were stonemasons and iron workers and all kinds of things when they came to American shores or Caribbean shores or South American shores. And so those Africans were not just, someone to look down on. They were, people who were being traded because of their value. And when we put the value back into that system and we understand that we created value for this country. When will this country create value for us? I think that's the scary question that nobody wants answered. And thinking about that is what we're doing right now in these reparation debates and discussions, and getting back to who Black people really are, what they add, the work they did, those details, how they were systematically prevented from doing that work as free people, how they were systematically unable to apply skills that they had been passed down from the generations within bondage. All of a sudden they couldn't do legally in these same southern states and northern communities. They were unwanted in these fields. Those are real hits when we do the calculus on what Black people have now, what they could have had, and what was denied them.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think one of the most valuable lessons I learned in just working with you, right, is the idea of free labor wasn't necessarily the value of slaves, because we think, oh, they got us here and then they made us do things or taught us how to do things. And what real history shows, and I think this is why these kinds of things, what you did, is important, and what this book is important, is because the real story shows that, like, you can't understand how this diverse agricultural system was created unless you look at the Black people, right? Because the people who came here specifically didn't know how to do things, right? Like, I mean, like there's two levels to that, right? So on one level, right, it were the people who left Europe, whether it was the Spanish or the French or the English, right? So they were the conquistadors. So they were just soldiers. They didn't know how to plant and build stuff, right? And then the English, they were looking for a get rich quick scheme, right? They were investors. Mm-hmm. That's what they called themselves, investors. And mm-hmm. they had to come up with a system, the headright system, that taught them that found a way for them to get people who knew how to do things over here, right? So mm-hmm. they mm-hmm. came here because in Europe, they were like, nobody leaves paradise to come to the unknown, right? So the people who came over here didn't have this kind of stuff in Europe. They didn't know how to build it. They didn't have farms that they were building in Europe or in the Caribbean. They didn't know how to build things. And so that story, the story of us, is teaching this country how to farm, how to, to build houses. They build houses that would withstand the heat. They'd never lived in this kind of climate. They've never seen this kind of soil. They've never seen that kind of ironwork. The ironwork that we call American ironwork, like they went specifically and said, hey, the best blacksmiths in the world are in there, and their iron is stronger. Let's go over there and get some of those, right? And that value that we gave to this country in building the biggest economic superpower on the history of this planet came because they went and got people who knew how to do stuff for them, right? Not mm-hmm. the labor, mm-hmm. but the intellectual property.
It was the labor too.
Right, it was the labor
too, but also, and.
Yeah. But I think mm-hmm. we flattened it out to, like, they had businesses and they got mm-hmm. some free labor, right? When the businesses were created by the people who they got the free labor from, right? Like, so it's not like you founded a company and got you some minimum wage employees. It is like your mm-hmm. minimum wage employees, the bare minimum, 0, created the idea for your company, worked for the company, and you were just the CEO in the air-conditioned office, right? And I think that
writing treatises on how lazy they were.
Right.
Jefferson.
And that story is part of why I think, like, that story, because you can't have simultaneously the mythology of these incredible geniuses who came forth and built a new nation, and people who know how to do stuff, right? Like one of those things has to be true. And so they made the myth, the truth, by eradicating the history, the true history of the people who did this stuff. And one of the most important things that I think that you focused on and told me, you gotta focus on this, right, is the idea that these people, these Africans in America, they didn't just leave, they just didn't bring the knowledge, right? That culture, that history, that way they related to the world is kind of what we call American culture, right? Like it ain't no European culture that's over here, right? The way we eat, the music we listen to, all of that became what we now know as American music. That ain't like the music of the founding fathers, what we call the American food, the fried chicken and the macaroni and cheese. That ain't, but also the democracy that was in that foundational document was not what we have today. It wasn't even what existed then. It was what they had to create from what we gave them, right? And I think that is so important, that inclusion of history of all of the people and the details of that teaches us not just like how things were back then, but why we are where we are today. And that so much of that is from the South. So tell us, like, what, when you talk about Southern history, like what is, in your experience, is the difference between that and the history that we are generally accustomed to?
I think for me, I've seen the expansion and the growth of different kinds of stories in what we would consider Southern history. I think when I was in grad school, if you said you did Southern history, you meant you didn't work on Black people, you didn't work on brown people, you didn't talk about these diverse communities and make it into one story. You were focused on the Confederacy or Southern white culture in some way, shape, or form. And so the pushback, the growth, the expansion to talk about Black history as Southern history, Black history as American history, has really happened in my lifetime as a scholar. And I think it's powerful and important. And as you said, it layers those combination, that making of a new American culture that bubbles out of the American South, is growing out of Native ways of being, out of African ways of being, out of European ways that are being shaped and in conversation with the people, the majority in those communities. And so when we look at the South and we look at American music and blues traditions and rock and roll, and all those things grow out of the ways in which Black Americans are talking to one another, or listening to each other, and building a vocabulary for the world that still shapes exactly how we think and harmonize and shape rhythm in American music today.
And you know, I keep attributing, but I really have to say, like, you did teach me a lot. One of the things that we talked about and we had so many conversations about is the idea, because which, you know, this book, I tell people, like, it's not just the history of Black people in America. It's also the history of America through the eyes of Black people, right? The Black people's story of America, right? Those are two different things, right? And one of the things that we talked about a lot is the idea of a Black diaspora and how that influence. So when we talk about America, we talk about the French influences and how the French were battling the Spanish Empire colonialism empire, and the race, right, for the Spanish to battle the get here before the Portuguese did, right? But we rarely talk about Black American history and the influences that the Caribbean and the African had on us. And I remember like this specific conversation that we had when you were telling me, well, you know, like the Black people in South Carolina who came, you know, most of them came from the Caribbean, but when we say they came from the Caribbean and the African influences on the Caribbean, and this was just a wow moment for me when you said, well, you know, they had been over there now as long as we had been over here. Like it was not just like a couple of generations of Black people from the Caribbean who came to the US, but it was like a century of Black people in like it was centuries of Black people in the Caribbean, and they had already created a. So if there's a Black American culture, there is a Black Jamaican culture, it's a Black Barbadian culture, right? That they had created and molded over centuries that was kind of a slightly different, and it all has roots in African culture, right? But that congealing had been done over there and then recongealed over here with people straight from Africa. And that idea of the diaspora influencing American culture and vice versa, right? And I really want, I think somebody, I hadn't been able to find one. This is a book. You could tell your smart history friends. The African American diaspora. So having said all of that, those things I said, one of the things that we talked about is the people who were enslaved in America for generations, and sometimes over a century, and then was like, as soon as they got the chance, they left here and went to Sierra Leone and to Nova Scotia and to the Caribbean islands and to South America. And there is a an African American diaspora had lived in other countries for centuries that hasn't really been explored in a lot of detail. And I think our influence on the world, on Black people throughout the world, right? Like there are people whose roots trace back to some grandparents who are enslaved that never lived here, right? And the idea of the diaspora, not just informing what Black Americans became, but what Black Americans became here, informing how these different cultures throughout the world understand themselves and their history. And I just want you to want to know if you know of anybody who's done that kind of work and where to find it if there is.
Yeah, I think you know, there's a wonderful organization called OSWAD that really does diasporic work among historical scholars, scholars of Africa, scholars of the Caribbean, scholars of America, in conversation about these histories. I mean, you know, when I think of this field, I think of Du Bois as sort of the founder. He founded everything. As you know, the person who was really drawing us back to think about an African diaspora and returning and being in different parts of that world and being in conversation to see those intersections that are just so obvious. I was laughing the other day at the Montgomery massacre and how Black Brazilians and Portuguese are on Twitter talking about that because they see their own sort of colonial struggles in our current, you know, racial conflagrations that are happening in the American South, because they're, you know, we look like each other. We may not speak the same language, but we come from the same people. And so there's so many parallels and connections in the way that we think, we move, we like our music, we like our food, we like all those kinds of connections that are lost to us in a conscious level, that when you see different folks from around that world, you can make those connections again. I remember, you know, being a teenager and going to Puerto Rico with my folks and seeing Black people who look just like me, speaking Spanish. And I'm like, well, how is that possible? You have the same texture hair and the same brown skin, and you're Puerto Rican. And that's when I started to put that together, that you and I could go to Paris and sit in a cafe full of people who look just like us, who are speaking languages from around the world. And that's the powerful reminder that we're not alone in this struggle. We're not alone in our history. And if we push past these sort of artificial boundaries, and push past the wars that I think, sometimes we're so focused on exactly where do you come from, and exactly, my experience is so different than everyone else's. They're interconnected, and we have a lot to learn from and to be inspired by each other. And Black Americans have inspired the world. We've inspired Black and brown people everywhere in this world because of our history, and the phenomenal way in which we have shaped a new vision about what's possible.
Yeah, I know I said that was the last question, but let me ask you this. This is something I've been thinking about for a minute. Do you think, and I'm really coming slowly to this, is W.E.B. Du Bois the smartest person? Du Bois the smartest person, the smartest American who ever was in America? Like, even like when you think of even Thomas Jefferson, which when you read Thomas Jefferson stuff, like you see really like he was kind of dumb on a lot of stuff, right? Like not just
Smart, but
wrong,
he was
a
he
product
was
or a product of
he
his
was
time.
smart.
Yeah.
He was well read. He was well read, and he listened to lots of different kinds of people. So he did know some stuff, but he was, exploitative of the knowledge around him. So I mean,
But
I'm never gonna give Jefferson any credit.
yeah, the one thing I would say, like even in that comparison, right? Like there were when you read Thomas Jefferson says to a lot of stuff like, "Oh, the black people don't know nothing. There's nothing I can learn from them." And anybody other than basically the European classic and the Enlightenment era people are the only people who really like know stuff. The people of
He was
my
lying. He
era,
was lying.
and then you got to go all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. And
He was lying because he knew
yeah,
he could walk out of that little room where he was writing that and get help from the Black carpenters and the Black brick makers and the Black smiths and the Black agriculture workers.
yeah,
He was always lying.
and I don't know, I don't know anybody. Like I've literally probably never had an extended conversation with any Black historian or anybody on Black history who like just didn't bring up Du Bois, and not just in the conversation of
You
Black
have to.
history, but in the understand like this dude really kind of like one of the things we don't give him credit for is like he basically invented what we call sociology now. Like what
He
we
invented
like,
sociology. He invented Black history. He started the study of slavery and Reconstruction. I mean, he did urban studies, basically comes
yeah,
from him through the Philadelphia Negro and the Atlanta studies, and
yeah,
first person reporting as a scholar. Like he started the
yeah,
NAACP
and
with activists.
every position like on Black history, he
He's
evolved
taken
into,
it.
yeah, like right, like he, people talk about the talented 10th, and that was elitist, but then he battled, but he also said, well, like you can't just educate the Harvard Negroes and leave the regular working. Like he evolved and eventually encompassed all of those things. He loved America, but then at the end of his life, he was like, hey, yo, I'm gonna head over back to Africa.
I'm out.
Yeah, right. And that's an interesting question to me because I've been trying, like even the white people that they give credit for. I've been trying to think of any, like, is he the smart? Like, we don't know all of the people, but I'm talking about of the people we consider scholars, he might be the head of the class. Like, go ahead.
He lived in a time period. He happened to have been born in a time period of like tremendous possibility that he found. Um, and he could see and he could crystallize. And I think he had a willingness to ask questions, to study, like a humility that he brought to studying in Europe and studying in the American South and looking at different kinds of things, and going to Africa and traveling the world and listening to different kinds of people. So he was he was an open person. So he was open to learning. And so I think in our examples of the world, he's the kind of person you want to be. You can be like a Du Bois if you stay open, you stay humble, and you keep learning and you keep striving to answer this hard question. But I mean, I have to put my girl Ida B. Wells in the mix. I mean, when we read her writing, it's fire. It just, she doesn't even sound like her time period because she's so plain spoken. She was so brave. She was just investigating and pushing journalism and analysis around rape and sexuality and things that we are now talking about. I mean, I got to put my boy Frederick Douglass in the mix. I mean, he taught himself how to be that grand of a man, how to be that visionary of a person, and he called it on a whole bunch of different things. So from where he came to what he became is astounding. No greater come up. I got to give my girl Ella Baker. Oh my gosh, she literally, like, you could teach the 20th century just by teaching her life, because she moved so many places. She was that humble, brave, listening, learning person, always building. Really didn't care if you knew who she was, but really was powerful in helping to craft the civil rights movement. So, I mean, the list of Black people who are brilliant and astounding, and we wouldn't even be in the running for who we are as a people without, it's a long one. I can keep going.
Yeah. I think it's important to note, though, that like all of those names that you mentioned, there's like a section on them in the book. And
Yes,
like now you see
yes,
why, right? Like now you can see why, right? Like she was like, hey, yeah, you got to put Ella. If you're gonna talk about the civil rights movement and the women of the civil rights movement, like you got to talk about the woman who kind of is the civil rights movement that we don't talk about, right? Like the reason that chapter exists is like, oh, these are the people who created it, and this all Black women, right? Like all of the ideas of the civil rights movement and came from the Black women who were doing the work and kind of in the background because of misogyny and I mean of patriarchy and sexism said couldn't be. There's so much stuff to explore, like some of the stuff that we couldn't even include in the book, like you wanted to do, and we never got around to it because we had so much to cover. Like we were going to do a whole chapter on the idea from Thomas Jefferson of like the idea of mixed race and how that came to be and how that evolved into like the one drop rule and our understanding of what is Black and what is white. Like there's a whole in, on my computer now, a whole chapter on that.
Well, it could be another book.
Yeah.
Follow up.
I'm just trying to chase after you. I'm just trying to chase after you. But y'all gotta you gotta read to understand. You gotta read Black folk. You got to understand. Like it's really one of the things is it ties this era that we kind of don't like. We go from slavery and then Reconstruction, and then we usually jump to the civil rights movement, and like we wonder like, well, how did all these people get to Chicago and Detroit, and what were they doing, and like how did they even make it up there? That's what Black folk is, right? That the story of those people, and specifically of that kind of forgotten part of Black history when we built our families and the future apart from the enslavement and the violence, what we did when we kind of had a chance to determine the path forward for our future generations. Black folk is kind of like what we did with our hands and our minds and our brains. And the interesting thing about it to me is the intention that they had, right? Like it wasn't like, oh, if I do this, we can survive. It was like, no, if I do this, then I can get this, which would allow my children to get this, which will allow me to build the idea of a family that, and what's remarkable about it is like that kind of thing we'd never had a chance to do before, and we created it from scratch, right? Like we created that Black working class not from looking at white people, because there weren't no working class. We were their working class, and then we worked for ourselves. And that's what's, to me, that's what's
Yeah.
remarkable about the book. And it's just so much history in it that, like, it could be about some Black folks 10 years ago. And
Yeah.
it could be about
Yeah.
some Black folks 110 years ago. That's the beautiful thing about that book. And you understand where, like, all of these things that we call the culture, how they kind of formed through a work ethic. And
Yeah.
yeah,
But
I
the
love
favorite things
I
that people
love the
have
book.
the favorite thing that people have been saying to me is like, I understand my grandmother or my great grandmother or my mom and her journey better, or I know now what my dad was really going through when I think back, or when I talked to my grandfather and he was quiet about these certain things. This book helps me see why he was reluctant to even bring it all up. It's just a way of discerning our intimate past,
Right.
and understanding and having appreciation for what that generation, what is really my grandfather's generation, survived and built. They were architects, like you said. They really built the
Yeah,
whole
and
world.
so much, like, again, like, why, like, just the little thing of, like, how do you like, if you from Georgia, how do you choose where you're going? Um,
Yes.
right? Or like, why, when you say I want to be a musician or artist, your grandmother says, "Hey, boy, you better get you a job and get you a good job at the post." Like, what that sentiment comes from, the origin of that
Yeah.
work ethic. Um, that's what Black folk is. It's this, and it's so much more. But I want to thank you for joining me. I want to, first of all, and most of all, thank you for helping me write this book.
Oh,
Like,
my
it,
pleasure. My
like,
pleasure.
and
It's amazing.
thank you. I hope you go out and buy Black Folk, go out and buy Black AF History, and thank you for
Absolutely.
joining us today.